So if you'll forgive the state of the ship, that's not really why we're here. We're here for Anne to launch a couple of her books. So what I'd like to do right now is just hand over to Mairead. Mairead is acting as Anne's personal assistant tonight. So there she is. Mairead, over to you.
Very much, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me the greatest honour to introduce Anne and the launch of her anniversary book, Liam's Story. And tonight she's going to tell you a little something. It's not exactly a speech and it's not exactly a talk. She's going to tell you what every good novelist should do. She's going to tell you a story. And it's the story of how this teeny weeny diary and this picture turned into this wonderful story. So everybody, if you just please relax and be seated and enjoy the next few minutes. Thank you. And Victoria Roberts.
Hello everybody, and thank you very, very much for coming along this evening. It really is great to see you all, and especially on such a filthy night. But I think we've got a lot of warmth and fellowship amongst us this evening. So, you know, I hope you'll just sort of relax and enjoy the story of this particular book. It holds a very, very special place in my heart, and this year's centenary of World War I, it felt right to bring it out again for a new generation of readers. The original was published way back in 1991 and involved a great long chain of coincidence. So extraordinary, it even appeared in a book on the subject. So if you want to have a look at that later, you can. It's hard to explain, except that from start to finish, it was a labour of love. And it seemed to attract love and dedication from a great many people. I don't mean the hearts and flowers kind. I mean the honest to goodness, everyday variety that we often take for granted. This old girl, and I'm talking about Sheildhall here, not me, is a good example. I look at the volunteers who crew this ship, and they work so hard behind the lines, and I know they're bound together by a shared love of ships and the sea. And okay, it may be a love-hate relationship at times, but that's the nature of the work that we care about. I wrote my first novel in my early 20s, but after sending it off to agents and publishers, I could have papered a wall with rejection slips. Disheartened, I didn't begin again until I'd lived a little. Always a good idea for a writer. But still I hesitated. Was I ready to sacrifice 2 years of my life to something that may never see the light of day? I'm glad to say that I had the bit firmly between my teeth before I understood exactly how long it was going to take. In fact, it took 10 years and became 2 books, not one, each born out of the other. So, where did it begin, this passion for the past? Well, at the age of 15, I was on my knees rooting through stuff from Grandma's attic. In a box of family obituary notices was a big brown envelope, and inside I found this photograph of a young soldier. The distinctive bush hat identified him at once as my grandfather's brother, who had emigrated to Australia in 1913. I'd heard about him. On our summer journeys to York when I was a child, my mother would remark on the poppies growing by the wayside and tell me about her father, who'd fought in the First World War, and about his brother, who was killed in 1917. Will's name, she said, was on the Menin Gate, a great memorial to the missing. But here he was, in this portrait. I remember sitting back on my heels and thinking how sad it was that he should have lost his life at the age of 23. But there was more. Inside the envelope was this little book. Imagine my astonishment when I opened it. It was a diary, dated 1916, Will's diary, with his name and number on the flyleaf. At the time, I couldn't believe that I was holding something so precious, something that he had written and no doubt kept close to his heart while those terrible battles were going on. The closely written pages record his journey from Egypt to France and the progress of battles from Flanders to the Somme and back again. But he also notes other important dates. In August 1914, he signed up in Melbourne. In late October, he set sail on the P&O ship Ben Allah from Albany, Western Australia. It's just 100 years ago this week that 14 troop ships left Albany for the war, and after 6 months' hard training in Egypt, found themselves storming the beaches at Gallipoli. At the time, I knew almost nothing about the Great War. Reading his tiny writing, making out the strange place names, was like having a few pieces of a 1,000-piece jigsaw and not knowing how they fit together. Trying to solve the mystery kept me occupied throughout an important year at school. If there'd have been a GCE on World War I, I'd have passed with flying colours. As it was, I scraped through the important subjects and went on to art school. I met my husband Peter around that time. We were two unconventional souls who recognised something in each other. The spirit of adventure, I think. Young and in love, we corresponded while he was away at sea. A few months later, I set foot aboard a merchant ship for the first time, the Port New Plymouth in Hull Docks. It was another exciting moment. I seemed to understand so much at once. Most of all, what motivated this boyfriend of mine. Suddenly, I wanted to be part of his life. I wanted to go where he was going. I wanted to see. I wanted to cross those oceans and see those ports that he kept telling me about. Peter didn't know it, but I made up my mind on the spot. I was definitely going to marry him. A few years later, the dreams came true. We married, had 2 children, and often went away to sea together as a family. We had a lot of fun, and I imagine my son Scott, who was with us this evening, could tell a tale or two about those days.
I hope he doesn't.
But on a more professional note, those long sea voyages were useful to me as a writer. They taught me how men think and work and interact with each other, and helped me to shape my fictional characters into believable human beings. I was in my mid-30s when my grandmother gave me Will's little diary, and suddenly that early desire to write a novel based on his life was reborn. By then I knew a little more about his background, certain aspects that may have driven him to leave York and embark for Australia. Enough, I thought, for me to sketch in the background and get on with the story. But then the first coincidence occurred. We were living in West Yorkshire at the time, and by chance in our little town museum I met a local genealogist. Her chief line of research was in York, 30 miles away, and our mutual love of York sparked the beginnings of a friendship. She persuaded me to check the details of my unusual family history, since, as she said at the time, in the passing down, family stories often get muddled. She was right. I discovered, on my very first foray into family history, that the facts had certainly been muddled, and the truth behind them was stranger than any of us knew. My focus shifted at once. To explain William, the writer of the diary, I knew that I had to write his parents' story first. Well, several years of research, writing, and weird coincidences later, that book became Louisa Elliot. Her entry into the world was attended by so many good fairies she couldn't help but succeed. One major factor rested on a chance comment made by the legendary publisher and feminist Carbon Khalil. She was bored, she said to the literary agent who'd just read my manuscript. Had he got anything interesting for her to read? Indeed he had, and he gave her my book. The fact that Carmen Khalil is Australian added to the list of benefits. She loved Louisa Elliott and was excited by the idea of Liam's story about a young Australian soldier. It was tremendous news. At last I was going to write the book that really mattered to me. Most of the research was in place, and thanks to Carmen, a visit to Australia was already being planned. There was just one problem. I had yet to decide what form the book would take. I found my answer on a visit to Ypres in Belgium. Ypres, or Wipers as the troops called it, is a truly amazing place. A medieval town reduced to rubble over 4 long years of war, it stands today like a phoenix risen from the ashes. The atmosphere is not at all what you would expect. It isn't sad, it's uplifting. And there, believe it or not, strangers meet and talk like friends. Different nationalities, the elderly and the young. It's a place that's full of love. Every evening at 8 o'clock, beneath the Menin Gate, the traffic is stopped for the ceremony of the last post. Tremendously moving, but for me on that first occasion, it was even more special. It was as we reluctantly walked away that I turned to look back. I saw the gateway lit up, people and traffic passing beneath it, just as they do in York. Past and present, I thought, existing side by side. And all at once I had it. The whole book came to me in a single, stunning moment. 2 wars, 2 sets of lovers, struggling to come to terms with the past and the trials of the present. It would work. I could see this story moving seamlessly between the 2 different eras. It was fantastic, and the only time that it's happened to me. Usually the form and content of a novel takes time to work out. Looking back, I can see how and why things connected as they did. That visionary moment had its roots in personal experience, in something I'd been trying to forget. While I was bringing the first novel, Louisa Elliott, to a conclusion, my husband Peter was away at sea, in command of a large oil tanker. The ship was sold, renamed the Endurance, never was a ship more aptly named, and sent to the Gulf. The new charter was to transport highly inflammable petrol and aviation fuel from Kuwait to Karachi, a round trip passing through the narrow Straits of Hormuz every week. This was in 1986, when Iraq and Iran were still at war, and when Exocet missiles were the preferred means of halting this lucrative trade. I'm not going to elaborate on that, except to say that Peter did it every week for 4 long months, while I was seeing the casualties on the TV news. Thank God he and his ship survived. Many others didn't. He didn't want to talk about it until 3 years down the line. I asked for details. The modern half of my novel needed a dramatic scenario, and all credit to Peter that he braved those memories and suggested the kind of crisis that might so easily have happened. The book that came out of it is a tale of parallel lives. Secrets are hinted at in a wartime diary and partially revealed through photographs and letters. Time slips, presenting a view of passionate but unwise attachments, old crises and tragedies which have left their mark on the present. Liam's haunting presence seems to be saying something, if only those in the present have the wit to understand. As for me, the writer nudged by coincidence and strange events into writing this story, I can only tell you that in a sense this book began with poppies on the road to York when I was a child, and it closed with the sudden appearance of scarlet poppies in my garden the summer it was published. The string of coincidences stopped in 1991 and didn't occur again until a couple of years ago. I was making a collection of first edition hardbacks for a book sale aboard this ship. The aim was to raise some money as the ship was desperately in need of funds. I was searching online for books in good condition and spotted a copy of Liam's story, the original hardback. It was for sale in the States. Imagine my surprise when it arrived. On the flyleaf, in my handwriting, was the inscription, "To Cousin Mary, with love from Anne." How it came to leave my American cousin's hands is another story. But how odd that it should come back to me, the author. The very next day, via my website, I received a message from a previously unknown relative in Canada. She had been introduced to my book, she said, by Cousin Mary, who lives in the States. With the word coincidence shouting at me, I knew it was time to take another look at these out-of-print books and polish them up for a new generation of readers. So, by coincidence, you might say, I've become an independent publisher. I must admit, it's been a huge learning curve and not one I expected to make at my time of life. Thank heavens I've had expert help, initially from my son Scott, who set me up with a website and introduced me to the digital world. But more recently from designer and technical wizard Ned Host. And Ned now lives and works in York, another coincidence, and other commitments prevented him from being here this evening. Ned was the one who designed the original cover for Louisa Elliott and has redesigned it for the new paperback. That was way back in 1989. We never met then, but hard on the heels of my Cousin Mary coincidence, another odd coincidence, yes really, put me in touch with Ned. And that, I think, is where I came in, so it's time to close. Thank you all most sincerely for coming along this evening to help me celebrate this new edition of a very special book. The message is clear. Love survives.
Away. And I know if she doesn't,